pleasure to introduce to everyone Alicia Smith, the Executive Director of Dyslexia Canada.
Thanks. Thank you, and thank you for coming. Before I get started, I would just be curious to know a little bit about the audience. So who's here because they have a child that is in a school-aged child right now, whether you're concerned about literacy or not? Like, who is here because they're strictly a parent? Okay, and who here are educators? Great, thank you. Okay, so it's a nice mix between both. So I'll try to speak in both ways to make sure that I'm hitting things for both of you. I am very much open to questions. It's a nice group here today, so if you have questions as we're going along, feel free to ask those questions while I'm talking. I think it would be probably better in this setting to address them as they come up, but I can also answer questions at the end for sure. So, as Matthew said, I'm Alicia. I'm the Executive Director of Dyslexia Canada. For those of you who are not familiar with Dyslexia Canada, we're a national charity, and our mission is to ensure that every child with dyslexia receives a fair and equitable education. And our organization was formed in 2016 by some successful dyslexic adults and parents of dyslexic children. And they got together and said, you know, what do we need to do so that we can better support children with dyslexia in the public education system? So they spent quite a lot of time doing research, talking to experts, talking to educators, talking to parents, talking to families, looking at education systems around the world, what are they doing, what are we doing, and what can we do differently? And we landed on 4 things that we feel need to change nationally so that we can make sure that every child with dyslexia receives a fair and equitable education, but also so that every child gets off to a better start with learning to read and school. And the 4 pillars of our mission are around core reading instruction, so making sure that we are using the best possible approach to teaching kids to read from the very beginning. The second piece is about reading assessment, which I'm going to talk to you about today, making sure that we're using an evidence-based approach to identifying children who need additional support with literacy. The third piece is making sure that we're providing intervention to those children at the time when they need it most so that we can prevent reading difficulties from happening in the first place. And then the fourth piece is around teacher education and teacher support and making sure that teachers have the knowledge and the skills and the resources and the time that they need so that they can support literacy for all children. And this is deeply personal to me because I'm dyslexic myself, and I went through this as a parent. This is my son, Marcus, on his very first day of kindergarten. This was a very long time ago. Marcus is now like quite a bit taller than me. He's going into grade 12 this year, and he's doing great. But it was a really rocky go with Marcus. So as a dyslexic parent myself, I was very, very concerned about making sure that I gave him everything I could so that he'd get off to a better start with reading than I did. And so my husband who is not dyslexic, he is a big reader. I think that's one of the things that, you know, I was attracted to in him, you know, all those big books you have there. That could definitely help our gene pool. But, you know, so we started reading to him from birth, and we both read to him, we both talked to him, we both sang to him, we engaged him in conversations. And when we brought Marcus to school, he was a very chatty little kid who could talk your ear off. He could tell really complex, really interesting stories. He had lots of background knowledge, and we thought, like, he is ready to go. He's going to rock this. And kindergarten was great. He loved kindergarten. He loved it. Like, he went and played with kids all day, and, you know, he was bringing home his little leveled books, and he'd tell me he could read them. He was so proud of himself, and he'd go through them. And then I very quickly started to realize that I didn't think he was actually reading them. It seemed like he might have been memorizing them, because I would point to a word that he had just read in another context, in the environment, in something that I was reading to him, and he'd have no idea what the word was. And I also started to notice in kindergarten that he wasn't really getting the alphabet. They were doing letter of the week, they were coming home with coloring pages with letters on them, and he did all those things, and he loved it. But I would point to the letter M on a sign, and I'd be like, what letter is that? He'd be like, no idea. Like, it just wasn't clicking. And so I was concerned about this, and I chatted with the teachers, and I will say I live in a small town. I'm from Ontario. I live in a town called Tiny, and it truly is tiny. And so I knew these teachers. They're wonderful people. I know they were working really hard, and I know that they were doing everything that they had been taught and they knew how to do. But they assured me not to worry. They said, you know, he's doing great. Like, his literacy development, we are not concerned about at this point. He's doing great. He's so smart. He's got such good, strong oral language skills. He's going to be fine. Great. Then he goes to grade 1. And, you know, he's still in those same leveled books. At this point, I think he's memorized all of them. But he can't progress beyond that. And we start to notice, and the teacher does start to notice in grade 1. But again, assures me, you know, everyone learns to read at a different rate, a different pace. You know, don't rush it. What's the rush? He's so little. I was also told boys develop more slowly. And he's my first child. I don't know. I don't know what I should expect of a kid in grade 1. I was concerned, but again, I was thinking maybe I'm just overly anxious about this because of my own experience. But again, we were reassured it's going to be okay. Now into grade 2, and he's starting to realize that he can't read and all of the other kids can. And he's starting to come home from school and saying he feels stupid and he doesn't want to go to school anymore. And he used to be chatty and outgoing, and that is just being stripped away. He used to love sitting there with his books, and now he throws them across the room and yells at us when we try to get him to read. And so we're really worried. But in grade 2, we're told, well, yes, we think there's a problem, but we can't do anything about it yet because we don't do assessments for dyslexia or literacy difficulties until grade 3. So we're just going to do what we can with him this year. We'll, you know, do lots of more guided reading with him. We'll do that. You work on those sight words at home. We tried that. And we'll get him assessed next year when he's in grade 3. And then we get to grade 3. And I say, okay, we're here, we're in grade 3. He's still not reading. He's still struggling. He's now in a mental health crisis. What are we going to do about this? This is not the child that I dropped off here at the beginning. And then we're told, well, he needs a psychoeducational assessment, but we have a shortage of psychologists here, and there's a really long wait list. And it's going to take years until we're going to be able to give him an assessment, if we ever give him one through the school system, because we can only do 2 per year. And he's not the worst child we have. And he's not a behavior problem. He's sitting quietly in the corner. He's not acting out. So we were advised to pay privately for that psychoeducational assessment, which made me really, really angry because I'm a huge believer in public education, and I always have been, and the right to an education. And I thought, are you kidding me right now? If we couldn't pay, it was $4,000 at the time, if we couldn't pay $4,000, are you telling me that you're just going to let him sit there? But we did. We paid for the assessment. We went through that process. Of course, he's dyslexic. Surprise, surprise. And through that process, and talking to the psychologist and reading his report, I started to get very curious about what was going on. And I started connecting with other parents across Ontario. That's when I first connected with Dyslexia Canada, but I was actually volunteering for another organization at that time, the International Dyslexia Association Ontario branch. I volunteered there. And together, you know, we looked at the research and said, there's got to be a better way to do this, right? So as a group of parents, we approached the Ontario Human Rights Commission and said that, you know, this piece here, this is a violation of our kids' human rights. They have a right to an education, and we need to change things, and we need to make it better. And I'm happy to say, lots of things are changing. So there's a lot that has happened since this photo was taken. It's really quite astounding, actually, how many positive changes have been happening in this space right across Canada. And it's so exciting to be here in Whitehorse with all of you, where there's lots of really great things happening as well. So the focus of my talk tonight is reading assessment, but before we can really get into reading assessment, I want to talk about reading, because unless we have a common definition of what we mean by reading, we can't really dive too much into the assessment piece. So there's lots of different ways to think about reading. There are lots of different models that are used to describe the parts of reading. The model I want to use tonight is called the simple view of reading. I love this one because it's easy to understand, it's simple, but it's also been around for a very long time, since 1986. It's been validated through research, and it's a really nice framework to discuss the components that go into reading, and then the pieces that we're going to talk about when it comes to assessment. So the simple view of reading describes reading comprehension, which of course is the goal of reading, is to interpret meaning from text, that's the goal, as the product of two distinct domains. The first is word identification, so that is just the ability to lift the words off the page to translate the symbols into words in the language. The second component is language comprehension, and that is the ability to understand what the message is. So that includes, at the word level, vocabulary, just understanding the vocabulary, but it goes well beyond that too. It includes a knowledge of the syntax, the way we put sentences together in the language. It includes background knowledge, understanding the topic. That also helps with language comprehension. So there's a lot that go into both of these pieces, but the big takeaway of the simple view is that both of these things are equally important. And that's why it's expressed through multiplication, right? Because 0 times something is always 0, right? So if a weakness in 1 is going to cause challenges, or strength in 1 isn't enough, right? If you think about this in a mathematical sort of way, because I'm really more of a math person, you'll see that if you've got a challenge in 1, it's going to impact reading comprehension quite a lot. So dyslexia is a difficulty with the first part, word identification. So lots of children with dyslexia, not all of them, but lots of them have very strong language comprehension abilities. Like my son Marcus, he was very gifted in the language comprehension domain, which we learned when we finally had his psych ed assessment. That was the best thing that came out of that, is that I could show it to him and I could be like, guess what, sweetie, you've got a grade 12 vocabulary and your language comprehension is in the 99th percentile, good job. So, but this is to say that dyslexia itself is a problem with the first part. So you can have strong language comprehension and challenges with word recognition. And that would be the definition of dyslexia, and that's going to affect the reading comprehension. But I just want to address a couple other things about dyslexia before we get into the assessment piece. The first one is that dyslexia is not a visual issue. So very, very often there's a popular idea that dyslexia is about seeing letters backwards or seeing words move around the page. This is not a correct idea about dyslexia. Individuals with dyslexia are no more or less likely to have visual challenges than anyone else. Of course, we want all children to have their vision checked regularly. That's a very good idea. But if the issue is reading, if it is dyslexia, it's not primarily a visual issue. Dyslexia is also not in any way related to intelligence. So again, sometimes there can be ideas that all smart kids learn to read really easily, right? And many smart kids do learn to read really easily, but there are lots of really smart people who don't, and it's because they have dyslexia in many cases, right? Another piece is that dyslexia is really, really common. It's the most common reason that children struggle with learning to read. Though it's something that hasn't been talked about a lot in education, I was really surprised by that when I was speaking about it with Marcus's kindergarten teacher, that wasn't more commonly discussed, honestly. Strange. I thought 30 years after I went through it that it would be more understood and commonly discussed, but it was actually less, I think. So just back to this framework, dyslexia, it's a difficulty with the first aspect, that is word identification, but both of these aspects are equally important. That's the big takeaway of the simple view. But they develop in very different ways. So we're going to go into the middle first and talk about language comprehension. So language comprehension starts to develop even before children are born, right? I did talk to Marcus when he was in utero all the time, and I was told I needed to tone my language down. But language comprehension, it starts to develop naturally. Most children don't need explicit instruction to learn how to talk. They just sort of start to do it most of the time. So language comprehension really does initially develop through interaction with adults and other children, through listening and speaking, playing games, singing songs, experiencing the world around them. That's how children start to build that base for language comprehension. So all those things that I was told as a parent to do, reading to my child, singing to my child, yes, those are really, really important things to do. 100%, you absolutely need to do that. But What about word identification? How does that piece develop? That is the big question. So we're going to play a game because you're all just sitting there and I'm talking a lot, so I want you to talk. So I'm going to put some words up on the screen and I want you to yell them out as quickly and as loudly as you can. Ready? Ready? Oh wait, no, hang on, I've got one more slide before we get there. How do we recognize? Okay, now I'm ready. Now we're going to go. Ready? Okay, here we go. Perfect, thank you. Yes, so you're so fast and automatic with word recognition that you just blurted that right out. Like you didn't have to stop and think about it at all. Those words were there, you instantly recognized them so quickly that they just came right out of you, right? Like, did that take a lot of thought? No, right? Like that is amazing. That is a truly amazing thing that you can all do. But how did you learn how to do that? Like that is the big million-dollar question, right? So for a long time in education, there are two big competing theories of how it is that adults get to this point where you can see the word and you just instantly recognize it, right? These were the dominant theories in education for about 100 years until like the 1980s kind of thing, from the sort of beginning of public education until the 1980s. And within a province, like in Ontario, I've done a lot of research into this, you could have a school in one town that was 100% whole word and a school in another town that was totally phonics-based, lots of different things going on. But at its core, the people that were phonics-based were saying we need to start with teaching kids letters and sounds, start at that bottom-up approach, and then build them up to words and go from there. And the whole word approach was this thought that you can do this so quickly that you can't possibly be sounding them out. So we should be teaching words as whole units. And so that is where like a lot of the flashcards and the Dolch and the Fry sight word lists and even the Dick and Jane books, like a lot of repetition in reading, that was all whole word. So these were the dominant theories in education of reading for a long time. There's a lot of debate that went back and forth. And then in the later 1960s, another idea got put forward, and that is this idea of whole language. And the whole language theory was different than the first two, because in the first two, in both cases, it was very much educator-driven, right? So whether you believed you needed to go bottom-up with phonics or you need to go top-down with whole word, it was very much about teaching the kids, right? Very much teacher-driven. Whole language was a different philosophy and theory of reading that was really presenting reading as something that develops the same way that language comprehension develops, that it is something that would develop naturally if kids were given opportunity, if kids were given exposure, if kids were in a literacy-rich environment, that it didn't really require a lot of explicit instruction. It just required us giving kids books and making sure that they had lots of time and lots of practice and lots of motivation to read those books, that they would figure it out. Another really big part of the whole language idea was the idea that words are not recognized through phonics, like they're not recognized letter by letter. They're also not necessarily memorized as a whole word, but this idea that, this is a quote from the original paper, that readers use not one, but 3 kinds of information simultaneously to figure out the words on the page. So this is often known as the 3 cueing method, which suggests that readers use context, they use the syntax or the sentence structure, and then they use the print, yes, but often just a sampling of the print. So it says sampling from the print just enough to confirm his guess of what's coming, right? So we don't really need to pay super close attention to all the letters in the word. As long as we can figure out the gist of the sentence, we're good to go. So this idea was put forward in 1967, and it percolated for a while within faculties of education. And then by sort of the 1980s, it really started to take hold in education. So this changed the entire way that teachers were educated about reading, and it changed what was happening in the classrooms and the resources that people were provided with. And people have very passionate ideas about all of these things. So the big question is, like, which of what these things is right? Like, which of these theories of how people learn to read is correct? And then the other big question is, like, how do we decide that? Like, how do we know which one is right? So for a long time, it was seen as a debate. So you will often see the reading wars or reading the great debate. Like, you have a you have an opinion and I have an opinion and we will argue. And some people will agree with you and some people will agree with me, and that's fine, right? So that's one way we could decide. We could put people in a room and let them just duke it out, right? But then what you decide on for education really depends on who you invite into that room, who gets to sit at that table, who gets to have that conversation, right? And there've been a lot of professions that study reading that have been shut out of that conversation for a really long time. So I suggest that instead of having people just duke it out and verbally joust, and we just go with who is the most convincing speaker, that we use science. Science, this wonderful thing that lets us ask big questions and, have really, structured ways of finding answers to those questions. So fortunately, there's a lot of science of reading, lots of scientific study of reading. So sometimes it's called the science of reading, or reading science, or just evidence-based practices, sometimes it comes up. But the science of reading itself really is a really big body of research. So people have been studying reading for a really long time and accumulated a lot of knowledge. This body of research is interdisciplinary. So it's not coming from just one lens of science. You have research coming from education, you have research coming through psychology, you have research coming from speech and language pathologists, you have research coming from cognitive scientists, you have research coming from through linguistics, you have research coming from neuroscience scientists. There's lots of different pieces and lots of different studies and ways of looking at reading. It also spans decades. So there's been the scientific study of reading has been going on since the 1960s too. It just hasn't had as much of an impact on what we're doing in schools. It's international and multilingual, so it's not just happening in English. There is an organization called the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. It's truly international. They have a big conference every year where reading researchers from all disciplines come together. It was actually in Calgary this year, which is great. I don't know when it was in Canada last. But they had presentations there where they were talking about learning to read in all sorts of different languages and scripts and all sorts of different things. Very cool. But the whole idea of the science of reading is that it does use a hierarchy of evidence to evaluate conflicting information and claims, the way we do with any other sort of science or the way you would do in health research. So you can have lots of different studies that say lots of different things, and it isn't until you have lots of different points of evidence that are converging on a point that you would say, we know enough about this thing to say that this is what we know to be true at this point. But when it comes to reading, there are a lot of things where there has been a lot of science over the last 50 years. And there are some things that we can say at this point, this is what we know so far about how kids learn to read. This is the best available information based on that entire body of research. So there is a very great little snapshot of this. If anybody wants these slides, I'd be happy to give them to you. I did link them, but you can look this up. The 10 maxims, what we've learned so far about how children learn to read. This is just a bulleted list of here's 10 things that we absolutely know from the scientific body of research at this point. And I'm not going to go through all 10, but one big key takeaway of this is that direct systematic instruction helps students develop the skills they need to become strong readers. Indirect 3-cueing instruction is unpredictable in its impact on word reading and leaves too much to chance. So that is that whole language piece. It just leaves too much to chance. So we know quite a lot. If you're interested in this, you can certainly go and check out that resource or go to our website. We do have lots of information there. So one of the other things that they have learned about reading through reading science is that reading actually changes the brain. So nobody is born reading or born wired ready to read. The process of learning to read actually forms a new network of connections in the brain to connect the visual processing part of the brain to the area of the brain that deals with spoken language and meaning and context. So it's through building these connections that you get to the point where you can be a fluent and automatic word reader. And it's really quite cool because there are in reading science, there are those scientists that do those fun brain scans and things like that. And lots of them at this point have done studies where they have actually done fMRIs on kids while they're getting reading intervention. So before they've had reading intervention and the midpoints during reading intervention, and they can actually see this area of the brain forming more and more activity while they're getting that really good intervention and instruction. But very skilled readers have a very developed network in this part of the brain. So that is one of the big key takeaways. So the other thing that they've looked at is how do we build these connections, right? Like what is the most effective way to get them? So in a nutshell, a simplified version of this, when you come to a word that you have not that you don't automatically know, I'm assuming you all know the word cat, but at some point in your childhood you probably didn't, and you would have had to slow down and actually look at the letters in the word, and then think about what sounds do those letters represent, k'at, and then blend those together to produce the word cat. So that act is something that you did that helped to build that network. Additionally, if you do it in reverse, so if you decided to write a story about your cat Fluffy, and you had to think about, how do I spell cat? And think about, oh, there are 3 sounds, cat, 3 sounds, what are the letters? And you map those onto the letters to spell the word cat. It's the act of doing that that starts to build these connections. There's lots of science behind this one now. It's very straightforward. So it's the act of decoding and spelling words that starts to build those connections in the brain that allow for that instant and automatic word recognition. And it's practice. So practice decoding and spelling lots and 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 lots of words over time is what leads to fluent and accurate word identification. And this part here, this green circle, is really, really, really important, because if kids can easily identify those words and they don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about them or decoding them or guessing what the word might be, then it frees up the rest of their brain to think about what they're reading. And that is really important for them to be able to do. It supports the language comprehension piece. So this is really important. This process is called, or this model is called orthographic mapping. And this is a process that everyone goes through to become a skilled reader. But it really is a process, right? It's not something you do once, it's a process that needs to get going. And we need to make sure that kids have all of the pieces of this so that they can have that process working in the background, right? Like that needs to be happening for them. So the big question is, what knowledge and skills do kids need to get this process going, right? So I have a word, I have a demonstration, another game, because I love games. So I'm going to ask you to read a word that you have never seen before. I know you've never seen it because I made it up. And I want to see if you can read it. So here's the word. Who knows the word? What did you say? Vandrosplation. Thank you. Thank you for saying my word. Yeah, see, I did divide it into syllables if anybody needed some help with that. So what did you need to know to be able to read vandrosplation? Actually, let's go back to the word. What are some of the bits of knowledge and skills that you needed to have so that you could do that? Because that was really impressive.
You're asking me?
Sure, yeah.
Well, you have to know that AN is a short vowel and that it's a root sound.
Yes.
You have to know that DR is a blend and that O in this is an open syllable.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know this, unless you've been taught it, really. J is also a long vowel, simply because it's at the end of a syllable, and shun is one of those crazy things in English that makes no sense, but yet,
Excellent, a great explanation. So yeah, so decoding a word requires knowledge of things like the alphabet, like we need to know the letters and be able to recognize those. Letter sound correspondences, phonics, like the basic ones, you used some of those there for sure. Spelling patterns and tendencies, you just told us the CVC part and the open syllable part, like that was awesome. Also word parts like prefixes and suffixes, like shun is a suffix, right? It turns something into a noun. So you can imagine that if we have vandrosplation, there's probably also vandrosplate, right? So anyway, it's a made up word, so not really. So that's called morphology. So these are some of the knowledge that you need to be able to do this, to engage in that process. And then there are also skills, right? So there's knowledge and then there's skills. So you need to be able to blend those individual sounds and the syllables together and then blend the syllables together to get to the whole word vandrosplation, right? And in reverse, if I asked you to spell Vandrosplasien, you would need to be able to segment it and pull it all apart and then map that onto letters. So collectively, that is called phonemic awareness. That's an important piece. And then you also need to be able to pronounce, to adjust the pronunciation, right? Because a lot of times in English, we have these fun vowels that make weird sounds that you're not expecting that they're going to make. So when you come to a word you haven't read before, you try a few pronunciations, and you try to flexibly adjust, right? For the syllable stress, for the vowel sound, until you land on something that sounds like it could plausibly be a word, right? So that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of knowledge and skills that kids need so that they can get that process going in the brain. And this knowledge and set of skills are ones that, some kids learn really easily. So there are some kids that, that exposure to print and they pick it up very quickly, and it almost seems like they do learn to read naturally. And that's great. We love that for them. But then there's a lot of other kids who their success with reading is really going to depend on their access to instruction, right? If somebody just explains all those things to them, it's going to be much easier for them. But really, like how easy or difficult it's going to be for kids to learn those knowledge and skills exists on a continuum. I don't know if you can see my continuum here at the bottom. For some kids, just a little broad instruction and they're off and running and they figure things out as they go and they're great. But then there's a group of kids at the end over here. These are my people. These are where the kids with dyslexia reside, right? And they need a lot of really good instruction and practice so that they can develop that knowledge and skill, so that they can have that process running in the background and use their time productively. So what happens if a child has a gap in those foundational knowledge or skills? If it's a child like my son, who in kindergarten, I could tell you he did really not know the alphabet, and he really was not getting there with letter sounds. So when we think about this, you come to a word you don't know, say maybe you do know the letters, but you're really struggling with blending those together. You're struggling with that, right? You don't do that. Well, here's what happens. So kids have great compensatory strategies. Wonderful. So they might skip the word. They might guess the word based on context. They might memorize the whole book like my son did, or memorize individual words as units. Like kids do that, and you can memorize whole words as units. You absolutely can. And that will get you to a certain extent. But when that is the approach to reading, kids usually hit a brick wall sometime around grade 2, right? Like you can't memorize the 30 to 40,000 words that a skilled adult reader can read instantly. The biggest compensatory strategy is that the kid will avoid reading altogether. This is hard. I do not want to do this. It does not make any sense. Leave me alone. So if that's what's happening, they're not building those connections. They're not getting that practice in. They might be spending a lot of time sitting with books, but they're not doing the work in the background that needs to happen so that their time is being used productively. And if that's what's going on, then they're going to have problems becoming accurate and fluent in their word reading. And that is a big problem. And it's a problem that grows over time. So this concept here, it's called the Matthew effect. It comes from a Bible parable, the idea that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, which I don't really like that aspect of it, but it's a good conceptualization of what's actually going on, right? So when you have kids that in kindergarten get off to a really strong start with those foundational skills, they are reading, they are doing that process, they are building those connections, and they are on an upward trajectory of becoming a strong reader. And when you have kids who in kindergarten have these foundational skill gaps, their trajectory is very different. And over time, the gap between the strong readers and the weaker readers just grows bigger. And this is 100% what happened to my son. By the time we got his psychoeducational assessment done, when he was in grade 4, he was still reading at a kindergarten level. So now we had like 5 years to catch up on, right? It's a lot. Whereas if we had understood what his gaps were when he was in kindergarten, we could have addressed them then. And this gap, it not only makes a challenge for the children with word identification, with that component of reading, as time goes on, it starts to impact the other area as well. So we often say that from kindergarten to somewhere around grade 3, that kids are learning to read, And then they make this transition to reading to learn, right? I don't think it really necessarily happens around grade 3. I think kids can read to learn and learn to read all the way through, but this is, fair enough. But the point is that if you have a child that has really weak word identification skills, by the time they get to grade 3, they're not really able to make that transition successfully. They're not reading to learn like their peers are. The language comprehension skills of those other kids start to develop really rapidly through their reading, because the language that you can experience through text is much richer. It has a much more varied vocabulary. It has much more challenging syntax. You have access to a lot more background knowledge than you're going to get through speaking with people. You can read about faraway lands and things that happen on Mars and at the bottom of the ocean, lots of things, right? So the kids who are strong readers, not only has their word identification outpaced, but their language comprehension also starts to take off. And so our kids, if they're shut out of that text, if they're not able to access it, their language comprehension can also begin to suffer. So you can have a child that started off with strong language comprehension that by grade 4 has a problem in both areas of reading. And you can see it super impacts the reading comprehension. But I would like to point out that it's not just kids with dyslexia that are struggling at this point. There are a lot of kids that are having this issue. Oh, I seem to be skipping a slide. I was going to show you some reading data, but it seems to be out of here. I had a slide that showed Canada's most recent PISA data. It's not good. That's the big takeaway. There's a lot of kids that are not doing very well with reading. But I think, good enough. So really, what have we been doing at this point? The whole language movement really took over in schools throughout the 90s. It was very, very much entrenched by the end of the 90s. Internationally, kids' reading scores were plummeting. Parents were mad. 3 different countries launched inquiries inquiries into what was going on with reading in the late 90s. The United States did one, Australia did one, England did one, Ontario did their own, all 4 of them in the late 90s. They all came to the conclusion that whole language was not it. It was not working for our kids. And they had a lot of recommendations around making sure that we were teaching those foundational reading skills systematically and explicitly. However, it didn't really lead to action in many places. Instead, we ended up with balanced literacy, which was this idea that we could take the best of both worlds and put them together. And so they certainly did add a bit of phonics into the program at that point, but it just wasn't enough. So if you're curious about any of that, there's a wonderful documentary series. Listen to this. Has anybody listened to this? This side of the room has, this side of the room has not, so yeah. Sold a Story, it's really good. There's a new episode that came out today, actually, which I haven't heard yet. But it really goes through the history of reading instruction and the issues in schools. And these were the issues that I experienced with my son for sure. The things that I brought with other parents to the Human Rights Commission in Ontario and have been working to get changed. So the big question, how can we do better? There's a lot of things that we could be doing better in education. I will say it's complicated. There are a lot of factors at play when it comes to teaching kids to read. This is not easy. I started with the simple view, but there's really nothing simple about this. It is very complex. But I will say that if we had a reliable way to predict which kids were on track when they were in kindergarten, that would really help, right? If we could just pick out those kids in kindergarten that have those foundational skill gaps so that we could do something about it in kindergarten before that gap grows, that would really help. So that's where universal screening comes in. So universal screening is just a very short, very simple, quick, reliable assessment that can answer a variety of different questions about children's reading. The first question it can answer is which kids need support, right? So understanding that in kindergarten is really, really important. The other thing it can tell us is, are there any class-wide needs, right? Sometimes those screening data will show you that your entire kindergarten class is having a challenge with phonemic awareness or really needs support in learning the alphabet. And then educators can use that to address the needs of everyone. It also provides a lot of really good information to help make the education system itself more efficient, right? So having that information, having that really clear picture of the skill development of all of the kids can help for planning. It can help districts, it can help principals, it can help provinces and territories really understand how they need to channel their resources effectively. It also helps us understand if our educators need support. So a big part of our mission at Dyslexia Canada is making sure that educators have the support that they need so that they can teach all the kids to read. So we can understand that in a certain way through the screening data because it gives you a picture over time. So we can look at that and say, across our system, here is a need. This is where we should be providing additional resources and additional training to support educators in that area. It also gives us a really good indicator of whether or not the curriculum that we have adopted is effective. If we see that we have lots of kids who are not progressing at the rate that we would expect them to progress, that's a pretty good sign that something needs to change. So screening tells us a lot of really good things, answers a lot of questions, but, and there's always a but, screening is not a diagnosis of a learning disability. So I just want to clear that one up right off the hop. That is not what screening does. It is just an indicator of risk, and it gives a snapshot of that child's skills at that moment in time. Screening is also not intended to be used for report card marks. It is not supposed to be used to grade your child. It is supposed to be used to identify the needs of your child before the instruction happens so that they can get the instruction that is targeted to their needs. So you do not need to prepare your child for screening. It is not something that you study for. It is not something you practice at home. It is just intended to provide that information so that they can get the targeted instruction that they need so that they can get this whole system up and running, right? Because that's really important. We want to make sure they have all the skills so they can do this. So screening looks at different skills at different ages, because there are different things developmentally that we expect kids should be able to do in that process that helps us understand if they're likely on that strong trajectory for reading or if they're in need of some support to get them onto that strong trajectory. So just tapping into this, starting in kindergarten at the beginning of the year, the big questions that screening sort of starts to look at is really, do they know the alphabet? Because that's the first thing. You need to know the alphabet if you're going to learn to read. And how quickly can they identify those alphabet letters? That's a really important piece as well. And then the other piece is around the sounds. So can they identify the individual sounds in words? That is something that is really, really tricky for a lot of people. That is a common challenge for individuals with dyslexia, is that ability to actually discriminate sounds. So it's kind of funny because often dyslexia is considered a visual issue, but more than anything, it's often an auditory, the inability to identify the sounds, the individual sounds and words, and to manipulate them. So what this looks like for kindergarten kids, and there's lots of different screeners available. There's lots of different tools that are being used across Canada now. I just have one that I chose because you can see it for free. So it's open source, so I chose this one. But one of the measures that this particular tool uses is called letter naming fluency. So this is what the screener looks like for a kindergarten child. And all it is that you sit down with the child, the educator gives the child a sheet of paper with letters on it and indicates to them that they start at the top and they just go across the lines and just read as many words as you can. And the educator is discreetly timing them in the background and makes a note of how many they have identified in 1 minute. It's very simple. It takes a minute, right? Only takes a minute to do that. But there is so much research that has gone into this, and we've discovered that how many letters that a child can name in a minute at the beginning of kindergarten or the middle of kindergarten, depending, there's different numbers at different times, is very, very predictive of whether or not they are on that strong trajectory or whether or not they might need additional support if they're at risk for being on that lower trajectory. So it's a very simple thing to do that we could do with all kids in kindergarten to ensure that they have the first piece of this going on, that they know the letters. Yes?
But how far would the child have to be into the kindergarten before you would do that?
So this is designed to be done at the beginning of kindergarten, and then they would do it again at the middle, and then I believe the letter naming is again at the end. And the expectation at the beginning is not super high, but they do get that baseline at the beginning of the year, and then they can see where they are in January as well. Some do. I think some do. Yeah.
My son does.
Yeah. And again, this isn't intended for evaluation. It's so that the teacher knows where the kids are with that, so that they can then, if the teacher happens to have a class full of kids where they all already know the alphabet, they're all great at this, they can target their focus elsewhere. But if they do this and they realize, well, very few of the kids in this class have that, then that's going to be a focus of instruction for kindergarten. So again, it's for that planning piece. So that's the first part, making sure they have the letters. So the next, or another common task, again, and different screening tools have different tasks, but I've brought a few different examples, is this task called phoneme segmentation of fluency. So this is an oral task. The student is not looking at any text at all. And there's a little video I'm going to play so you can just sort of see what this looks like. Hopefully you can hear.
We are going to say sounds and words. Listen to me say all the sounds in the word fan. Listen to another word, jump. Your turn. Say all the sounds in soap. Very good saying all the sounds in soap. I'm going to say more words. I will say a word and you say all the sounds in the word. Song. Count.
We don't have to watch her entire phoneme segmentation fluency, but that's just to give you an idea of what that is, right? So it's just, the educator, it's a standardized assessment, so there's a lot of research to show, what the developmentally expected number of sounds that the child can segment in a minute. Going through, and so there are benchmarks at different points in the year, so you can see based on that benchmark, is this child where we would expect that they would be with this at this point, or is this an area that we need to provide them with additional instruction and additional support so they can develop that? Because that skill is very important for this top part here. If they're having difficulties with segmenting sounds or blending sounds or identifying sounds correctly, they're going to have difficulty with actually sounding out and decoding words and building those connections. So that's a really important piece. So later on in kindergarten, throughout the year in kindergarten, they're going to be doing lots of great instruction where they're practicing phonics and they're decoding words and they're putting it together. And so the assessments change. So by the end of kindergarten, and again, it's different with different tools, but by the end of kindergarten, they really want to tap and we really want to know, have they learned some basic phonic sounds? Do they know their short vowels and their consonants? And can they apply that knowledge and those skills that they have to sound out simple words, right? So a screening assessment that is very common for this is nonsense word reading fluency. And this might seem a little bit weird, why on earth would you have kids read made up words? I made you read a made up word before, right? Why would you do that, right? So the reason that you do this is because then you can really tap and see, has this child just memorized a whole bunch of words? Or do they have the skills so that when they're doing independent reading and they come to a word that they don't know, that they can break that word down and successfully decode it? That's a really important thing to know. So they use these nonsense words for that purpose. These are only intended for screening assessments. This is not something that we want to encourage practicing reading nonsense words. If your kids are reading, they should be reading real words, so they're making those real connections so that they're building up their fluency. But this is an important piece for screening assessment. And it's a really good way to tap and understand if kids have developed that ability to decode words that they don't know so that they can start to build those connections. So that's kind of what it looks like in kindergarten. Similar assessments happen at the beginning of grade 1 and throughout grade 1. And again, it depends on the screening tool that you're using. But with most screening tools, by the middle of grade 1, they start to add in passage reading. We want to know really, is the child now able to put all of these skills together to start reading connected text? And how accurate are they at reading that text? And how is their fluency developing, right? That ability to read accurately and automatically. So starting in the middle of grade 1, they will introduce oral reading fluency. And so what this is they give a passage to a child, and again, this is a 1-minute read. You read for 1 minute, though you don't have to tell the child that it's 1 minute, but we look to see how many of these words can they read correctly in 1 minute, right? And there's been a lot of research done on this. It seems like a very simple and sort of ridiculous thing, like why do I care how many words my child can read in a minute? But it's highly predictive of whether or not they're on the path to becoming a fluent reader. And it's also highly predictive of their comprehension ability. I mentioned before when I showed that model that fluent reading frees up working memory, it frees up your brain to think about what you're reading, and it really supports comprehension in that way. And a lot of research has shown that oral reading fluency, it's not a direct measure of comprehension, but it's a good proxy for comprehension, right? So the children who are reading fluently at the level we would expect them to read at that age, there's a high degree of probability that their comprehension is also on track. So there are different benchmarks or different fluency scores that would be considered appropriate at different ages. So this is a very confusing slide, I recognize this, but there's been a lot of research into oral reading fluency over 20 years, where they have taken passages and they've had, thousands of children read them, and they, look at their scores, how many words correctly do they read per minute, and then they break it into percentiles. The same way that we did when, who remembers when their babies were born and you had those little percentile charts, height and weight percentile charts, right? Same idea, right? So you're not aiming for the 90th, that is not the goal here. 50th is totally normal, that is the normal range. This isn't this isn't like grades in school. 50 is great, 50 is wonderful. And you can see that it changes over time. So at the top is grade 1. So in the middle of grade 1, I think the top of my slide is a little cut off here, so you can't quite see it. But in the middle of grade 1, 29 words in a minute is what is the 50th percentile for oral reading fluency. And then it goes up. And then you see in grade 2, there's the summer slide period. That's totally expected and anticipated. And then it goes up over time, right? So it's just making sure that kids are kind of on that developmental trajectory where they need to be. So then the big question is, so what happens if the screener indicates that your kid might not be on track, if it indicates that there's some risk or their scores raise a lot of questions, what's next, right? And I get that question a lot. It's I've been across Canada talking about screening, why we need to do early screening, we need to catch the kids in kindergarten. People say, yeah, but what are you going to do about it? I'm like, well, actually, there's a lot you can do about it. But first, we need to understand what it is that they need help with, right? So there's a lot of different pieces that go into that word identification and reading. And we need to understand which part of this model is this particular child struggling with, right? And it depends on how old they are when they are screened. That oral reading fluency screener goes all the way up to grade 8. You can do that not just in kindergarten, but you can keep going with that all the way up. And that, when you get into the screening in the older grades, grade 2 and beyond, really, it's just tapping word reading fluency. That's the thing that it's looking at first. So if you are in that boat and your child's oral reading fluency is low, then the next thing to ask is, where is it breaking down for them? What is it that we need to focus on? So the next kind of assessment that I'm going to briefly talk about is diagnostic assessment. And this, again, these are assessments that can be done by your educators. You don't have to go to a psychologist and pay for this. And these assessments can really help pinpoint exactly which skills your child needs support with. So they're different from screeners in a couple of different ways. They often take longer than a screener. The screeners are designed to be very, very fast so that educators can do them on all of the kids up to 3 times a year. The diagnostic assessments often take a little bit longer. They're a little bit more in depth. They're not necessarily as standardized as the screeners. And they're not always necessary for every child. Sometimes there are situations where you might want to do them for an entire class, but typically they're not necessary for everyone. If there's been a flag on screening, then you would move to diagnostic assessment. So at Dyslexia Canada, we have a parent handbook. I have one physical printed copy of it left. We're hoping to get more copies printed. But in here, we have this little sort of flow chart that you can work through. If you're concerned about your child's reading, you know, if you have a child that's in grade 3 and beyond, you'd start at the top. You can ask these questions, and it kind of guides that diagnostic assessment process so you can really understand, like, where do I need to be going and looking for where do we start to provide support for my child. This guide is available on our website, so you can get it from there. And I do hope that we will have more copies printed in the future, but that's what we have. Oh, actually, Fawn at LDA has something to say.
Okay, I'll say it. Yeah, just wanted to let people know that if that's something of interest, we had some copies printed at LDA. So that's the Learning Disabilities Association of Yukon, if you're not already familiar with it. And so I do this screening work because it hasn't been something that's been done in the schools yet, but it's coming really soon, right? I don't know if you want to talk about that in a bit. So I've been doing this work, and hopefully I won't have to do it anymore soon, but we have resources for families where there is more of a struggle and maybe they need tutoring, for example. Our tutor coordinator is also here, one of our tutors is here. So there's lots of great resources in the room today.
Excellent,
Yeah.
thanks, yes. So the next thing I would say is if your child has been flagged on screening, that your job as a parent, and this is what I do all the time as a parent, is to ask a lot of questions, right? So the first question that I would really ask the educators is, what skill or skills does my child need support with now so that they can get back on track with reading or get on the right trajectory? But I would also ask, how do you know that, right? You know, what assessments have you done to understand this? Can I see these assessments? Can you show me what it looks like? Can you tell me exactly which skills my child needs support with at this point? You also want to ask about goals, right? What is the goal of this intervention? Like, do you have a set target that we are working towards in this period of time? I think goals are really important. Otherwise, we're just treading water. And what is the plan? Like, what is the plan that is going to help us reach this goal, right? A goal without a plan is just a dream or something like that. I love that, but you know, so you need to have a plan to reach the goal. So as a parent, you want to know what is the plan. And you also want to ask, what are the programs or strategies that are going to be used to support my child in reaching that goal? And then my big favorite one is, how will we know if your plan is working, right? I trust no one anymore. I want data, I want a plan, and I want to know how we're going to measure the effectiveness of that plan. So again, in the Dyslexia Canada Parent Handbook, we have a series of questions that you can ask. They're broken out by grade, specific things that you can ask your educators about your child's reading development, intervention that they might be receiving. And then we all have sort of like our thumbs up, thumbs down answers. So, you know, if they say sort of the things in the green bubble, you're probably good. If they say things in the red bubble, email us and we'll help you. So, you know, just to be aware. So I think it's really important to know what questions to ask as a parent. And I do really think it's important to ask specifically about intervention delivery. So this was something that I experienced myself with my son. So, you know, we went through the psych ed assessment process. We found out he's reading at a grade 1, no kindergarten level. I advocated for him to get support in the school. That took a long time, but I did get assurances that he would be in a program. At first, it was not an evidence-based program. We got that sorted out. And then we had, you know, all these things. I had a plan. They gave me the plan. He's going to have this program. The program is going to happen 4 days a week. It's going to be an hour a day. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. But then, you know, be asking him at the end of the day, so how was your reading intervention, buddy? What? What are you talking about, right? So I did everything I could to learn about that program. You can find a lot of information on the internet, so educate yourself about that program, learn everything you can, and try to track how often it's happening. That is a really important thing to do. So in some provinces, actually, I shouldn't say some provinces, in PEI, they have a policy where any child that's getting reading intervention, there needs to be a log of when the intervention happens. So there's a chart, and it's marked on that chart every day. Intervention happened, A for student was absent, or there's a code for it didn't happen because it just didn't happen because something else was going on at the school, like it was canceled, C for canceled. It didn't happen because we didn't have a teacher. It didn't happen because we had a field trip. It didn't happen because we decided to have an assembly that day, or there's a fire drill, or whatever. Having that information and knowing if the intervention is actually provided is really, really important, because you need to understand, is the intervention not working? If the intervention isn't working, you need to be able to understand, is it that the intervention isn't the right fit for my child, or is it not working because we're not actually doing it? It's really important to be able to differentiate that. So I always suggest that you ask for data on that intervention. You want to have real data to help you understand if that intervention is working. And so the third kind of assessment that I'm going to talk about today is progress monitoring. And progress monitoring is an assessment, it's an evidence-based assessment that gives real-time feedback so that we can understand if an intervention is actually working for a child. So most of the screening tools that are available have built-in alternate forms for progress monitoring. And often it's that oral reading fluency you're progress monitoring with. If the kid is like working on those kindergarten skills, you might be progress monitoring with something else. But for the sake of this, we'll look at oral reading fluency. And so the nice thing about this is you get this beautiful visual chart, right? So in this case, this is a student that needed intervention. And I'm going to just jump over here. So the benchmarks change over time, right? As students are supposed to be progressing. So on this chart, there's a green line and there's the red line, right? So this student started below the red line, so they're below the benchmark. If we set the goal of just getting them to the green line, by the time they got there, they would still be below, right? Because the line has shifted. So intervention planning has to start with choosing an ambitious goal that is going to eventually get this kid up to the green line, like up to benchmark. It might take an extended period of time. You might not get there all in 1 year, but the ultimate goal has got to be to get the kid up to benchmark. So you start with where they are, you figure out where they need to be, you draw a line. That's the trajectory that we want the kid on. And then every 2 to 3 weeks, as they're getting intervention, the educator can do a little probe to see where they are. Are they tracking on the trajectory, on the slope that we need them to be on so that they're going to make it to that point in time? So the rule of thumb is if there's three progress monitorings below, you need to do something differently, right? So that's where there's a line drawn here. In this case, the educator recognized this child is not making the progress they need to make. They altered the intervention, and then the child started to progress at the rate they needed to progress at. So this is really, really important for kids that are getting that intensive intervention, the kids that are really far behind. This isn't necessary for every single kid. If you're in kindergarten and you've got 60% of the kids in the class that are below benchmark at this point on, alphabet letter names, you can do some whole class. You don't need to do quite this level of progress monitoring. But for your kids that are well below, your kids that are dyslexic, your kids that are getting intensive reading intervention, this is really, really important so that we can make sure that that intervention is working. So now we can talk about psychoeducational assessments. So I've been sort of referencing them throughout the course of this presentation. I actually wasn't even going to talk about them, but then I realized that when I said reading assessment in the title, that some people might be expecting that I was going to talk about psychoeducational assessments, because that has been kind of where we go for a long time. And they're still necessary, they're still important for some kids in many cases. But the goal of this whole system of assessments that I've just laid out is that we can reduce the number of kids who require psychoeducational assessments. So if we're doing that screening, if we're doing those diagnostics, if we're doing good progress monitoring when kids are in kindergarten and grade 1, we should be able to get many of the kids onto the slope that they need to be on so that they're not going to require this in grade 3. The second piece is that with this system of assessments that I've laid out, you're collecting really amazing data about the kids throughout their entire journey, right? And that really helps to streamline the psychoeducational process for the kids who truly do have dyslexia, who do need to have, or a learning disability, who do need to have those psychoeducational assessments. Because now you're not showing up to the psychologist with a bunch of really meaningless data, to be quite honest. Like usually it's the report cards you get. It's like, oh, they got an A, they got a B. Like, what does that mean? You're showing up to the psychologist with this really beautiful profile of this child over time. Like, here's where they were with all these skills developmentally. That record of intervention that I said is really important. You can show, here are the interventions that they have received. Here are the things that they've tried at school. Here's how their progress monitoring went, and they're still not on track. And that information can help the psychologist to make that diagnosis much more quickly, right? So I live in a place called Tiny. It's very small. We don't have a lot of access to psychologists. I imagine you don't either. So you need to be able to use those resources as efficiently as possible. So by collecting all of this data, it can really help to make sure that they can see all the kids that they need to see. So in conclusion, in summary, ensuring kids develop foundational word reading skills is really important, very, very important. Using an effective system of assessments and starting in kindergarten really helps. Different types of assessment answer different kinds of questions. Who needs support? That's screening. What support is needed? That's diagnostic assessment. Is the support working? That's progress monitoring. And while assessments answer a lot of questions, they often raise a lot of other questions, especially for parents. You get the screening results back. What does this mean? What are we going to do? How are you going to deal with this? What is the plan? Who is delivering the intervention? All of these things, lots of questions. And we at Dyslexia Canada, that is what we do. We are here to help support with those questions. So we have a program called Dyslexia Compass. It's free. It's available to anyone in Canada. You can email us. We have a team. We have volunteers. We can also, I know LDA does a lot of this as well. We can help you understand that assessment data. We can help you understand the next steps for your kids. We can help you speak to your educators, speak to your schools. We do things like we assist with letter writing for parents. If you're writing to request services for your child, we will Zoom in for school support team meetings if you want somebody to be there with you who will just be another person in the room that can help ask those questions or make sure that you're getting the clarity that you need back. So we are here for you, and I will thank all of you for coming out to listen, and if you have questions, I am happy to answer those. Yes, yay, there's a question right from the beginning.